Alrighty, good morning, everyone. My name is Dylan Williams, and we would like to welcome you to the Summer 2020 Eastern Mediterranean Security Conference. Emmanuel College Institute of Eastern Mediterranean Studies since 2012 has been organizing a 4-week Eastern Mediterranean Security Studies program for students and young academics interested in the interaction of democracy, energy, geopolitics, and security in the region. This competitive program has allowed students and participants to study and experience firsthand the importance of the region that has been cultural, economic, and geopolitical vortex since antiquity. In 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic is yet another conditionality that has altered the dimensions of security and complexity of the area. Since travel to the region is prohibited this summer, IEMS is EMS is cooperating with the Konstantin G. Karamanlis Chair in Hellenic and European Studies, and the Institute of International Relations will be hosting a 1-week program of focused lectures, presentations, and panel discussions. The 1-week program will bring experts from the region in 2 sets of lectures aimed at assessing democracy, energy, and geopolitics on the role of leadership, diplomacy, and statecraft in this changing security environment of the Eastern Mediterranean. Our presenters this week come from different countries of the region, as well as backgrounds. We have a mixture of policymakers, diplomats, and academics. The full program is available once you register for the conference. Today, I have the distinct pleasure of introducing Dr. Colibasanu, who is a senior geopolitical analyst focusing on strategic competitive intelligence analysis. Dr. Colibasanu has worked for Geopolitical Futures and had joined Political Futures team as a senior analyst in 2016 after working for more than 10 years with the global analysis firm Stratfor. She is also leader of the AC Plus group for the firm Ferinvest Technic Plus Service SRL in Romania. Ms. Colibasanu has worked in the past with George Friedman and Robert Kaplan, in addition to having been an honorary advisor to the Romanian Minister of Energy. Dr. Colibasanu works at the National University of Political Science and Public Administration in Romania. Additionally, Ms. Colibasanu is a trainer on geopolitics for European Affairs and program at the Romanian European Institute. She holds a doctorate in international business and economics from Bucharest Academy of Economic Studies. She also holds a master's degree in international project management. She is an alumna of the International Institute of Politics and Economics from Georgetown University. Now, before turning over to the microphone to our speaker, I wanted to let you all know that I will be acting as the host of this event and will guide the Q&A. The duration of our program will be 1 hour and 30 minutes. I would like you all to turn off your microphones and to use either the chat or to raise your hand for questions. We will try to answer all questions. It's nice to have you all here and hope that we have a productive presentation and discussion. Now I'll be turning it over to Dr. Antonia Colibasanu.
Thank you very much. Thank you to the organizers for this effort, and thank you for inviting me. And good morning and good afternoon to everyone that is participating in today's webinar. Indeed, it is a pleasure to be with you, considering all your backgrounds, not to mention that I have here on the list of participants a lot of names that ring Greece and Middle Eastern names, along with American and Romanian names. So thank you very much to the participants coming online today. As Dylan has said, I'm going to try to answer questions as they come. So if you have a question during the presentation, please do raise your hand or have it in chat. If I don't see it, then certainly Dylan will interrupt me and I will be able to answer it immediately. Now, I am going to share what I prepared, which is a presentation about the topic of today. And sorry for the pause. Technology is sometimes making excuses to bother us. And today we're going to talk about how Eastern Mediterranean and the Black Sea are actually two regions that are contributing to Eurasian stability. Now, because I do geopolitics and my background is actually mostly in geopolitical analysis, I will start by saying a few words about what is that we are dealing with when we are doing geopolitics on specific regions. And that is always have the map, travel the map, as we say, something that we don't usually consider very useful until you can only travel the map as we do today. And then after you have traveled it, look at the intersections that you are seeing on the map. Ideally, go to those intersections and experience them, which is why such programs exist actually. That is how you learn what is actually important in the world affairs and how geopolitics drive foreign affairs and diplomacy. So on this map that you have here, you have the critical points, the intersection points that stabilize the world. And as you're seeing in the points, 2 points out of the main 4 ones that are stabilizing Eurasia are encompassing Eastern Mediterranean. The other 2 points are driving towards the Eastern Mediterranean. It is where Asia comes towards Europe and towards the Middle East to Africa. Now, the points themselves are also trade and integration points, which means that the human flows and the commercial flows are what are most important for driving stability to both continents, Eurasia and Africa, as well as the intermediary, which is the Middle East, and which makes the Middle East actually most troubled. It is a region where other regions meet. Now, to zoom in from the world, why did I choose to talk about the Black Sea? Considering your program is mostly focusing on the Mediterranean and Eastern Mediterranean area. It's not only because I'm from Romania, which is probably why I know a lot of things about the Black Sea. I also enjoy going to the Black Sea. So what is it that makes it important? It is basically the connection that we see between Asia and Europe that Black Sea drives to the Eastern Mediterranean from the Caspian Sea. So in a sense, the Black Sea is a node that integrates the Mediterranean Sea into the politics of Europe. And it also integrates the Mediterranean Sea into the politics of Asia. Historically, this area has been an area of flows again. And historically, we have seen how peoples have come together or come apart in these areas. We have the Caucasus and Balkans, which we know from the news even today are the most troubled regions. Now, for geopolitics, when we look at geopolitics, we don't only look at the map, right? Even if the map is the guiding source of our thought, we look at the human being and how the human being comes together in society, how humans form communities and how those communities transform themselves into societies and currently into nation states. Historically, we've talked about empires and other kinds of states, but nowadays we are looking at nation states when we are talking geopolitics. And within those nation states, we are talking about the economics, the politics, and the military, which come together with the idea of conflict, but also with the idea of defense, right? So the Eastern Mediterranean, the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea are not just dots that connect the world, but are dots that connect countries, that connect cultures, and obviously economics. So they are on the map, on the so-called supply chain of the world, in all senses. Now, even if the map is simple, right? It tells you that the culture of the north is different than the culture of the sea, of the south. The culture of the land is different than the culture of the sea. It is getting a bit more complicated and a bit more complex when we're talking geopolitics, particularly because we add to those intersections concepts that relate to putting together politics and economics into buckets that establish influences. So in the case of the Black Sea region, we have another important point to make, that it is the point where Europe breaks from Eurasia, or Asia breaks from Europe, from Eurasia. It is the point where the peninsula becomes to shape what we call European politics, and what used to be Europe for many centuries since antiquity. So if the Roman Empire or whatever the Ottoman Empire has stretched along Europe, it has been always towards the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. Now, currently, or in more recent history, we have the line going from St. Petersburg towards Rostov-on-Don that is breaking apart the Eurasian continent, kind of leaving a part of Russia into Europe and leaving it also into Asia, and delimiting influences, which is why we talk about sphere of influence on the continent, and also we talk about interesting colliding interests in the Caucasus and the Middle East, which comes southern. Now, a bit of more theory, just to make sense of the maps that will follow, because there won't be anything else but maps following. We'll look geopolitically at the state, considering its functions. And we consider politics, conflict, defense, and economics coming together towards the functioning state as the state producing wealth, the economic function, having external dimension, which balances the economics with politics, supporting its strategy on stable internal relations, which refers to the political side of the state, and defending the wealth that the state produces using the three other functions. Now, to go into the region again, considering the theory, it is not new to us that we have gone from creating wealth to expanding influence, external relations, and to colliding with other interests in this area. So I've chosen not the Roman Empire, but the Ottoman Empire, just because the recent past is more recent than the Roman Empire, even if for those living in the areas that I've mentioned, the Black Sea region or the Eastern Mediterranean region, it is easy to talk about how history and antique or medieval history comes together into the current day-to-day politics and international affairs. I have chosen the Ottoman Empire, as I've said, just to show you what kind of balancing act has the Ottomans done on the Black Sea and the Mediterranean Sea altogether, but also because currently we have a certain power in the region, namely Turkey, that is promoting the idea of neo-Ottoman politics. And I thought to be a little bit more actual and less theoretical when we are talking geopolitics in this area, just because there are a lot of events currently to talk about, and we should not be shy in talking about, especially with such an audience. So considering what is going on in the world, and considering, and I mean Corona, of course, the pandemic, and also considering the position of the Black Sea and the Mediterranean Sea exactly on the global supply chains, which are the most affected by the pandemic, we have to note that the balancing act is very important in these areas of all powers. Obviously, we're no longer talking about the Ottoman Empire, but we are talking about a lot of cultural, historical forces coming together. We're also talking about politics being shaped by these forces, as we are also having technology playing a very important role, not only in this region, obviously, but especially in a region that is very much crowded. So what you have in here is history and current affairs put together, which is to say that the former Soviet Union, the bloc that has made recent history, very recent history, has also shaped how the world of buffer states has become. Now, I'm using a concept that not many may be familiar with, buffer states, which is essentially the states that have turned to be independent after the former Soviet Union turned to become Russia. Obviously, after the buffer states became independent, they have retained much of the culture and much of the idea of former Soviet Union. Some fearing that it may come back again, which is the Russian influence, may come back again in a negative way, and others thinking that the old days have been rather better than the current ones, considering the transition and painful transition that some states had to go through when right after the former Soviet Union collapsed into independent states. Now, what remained of the former Soviet Union currently is Russia. In the same time, what remained of the former Soviet Union, and more importantly of the Cold War, is the buffer zones and the territory that relates to influences of the empire, of the former empire, which is usually the borderlands, what we call in geopolitics, again, borderlands, is where influences come together and where instability is more dense, which is Central Asia, the borders of the former Soviet Empire with China, Afghanistan, but also Iran, and the Caucasus. Well, in Europe, and in my country in particular, we talk about the buffer states when we refer to Ukraine, Belarus, and the Baltics, which is the area that Russia wanted to keep under its own influence. And we tend often to forget about these states here, which caused a lot of trouble after the Cold War ended, not only for Russia, but for the entire world if we're talking about Afghanistan. Cold War conflict, post-Cold War conflict because of the terrorist war and the terrorist idea, terrorism as an idea for conflict. Now, also, you have on this map the idea of culture in terms of religion, the Islamic fault line, which is more than anything the idea that differences create conflicts, and not coming together in form of cooperation also refers to distinct differences between the way that we are seeing the world. And again, we are looking at the Middle East as the main area where, Islam as culture and religion exist. But in fact, it is not only the Middle East. As you can see, this spreads into Europe through the Balkans. So again, going back to the map that I've shown you earlier, the Ottoman Empire, something of the Ottoman Empire has sticked with the idea of administering the world, but also of seeing the world, which is through religion and culture. Now, I would like to pause a bit just to ask if there are any questions so far, because I want to give the chance for the participants to ask questions, if any. I do like hearing myself, but not that much. I'm guessing not, because I don't see anyone in chat. So no. Okay. So I'll move forward, not that forward. Now, for you that do not necessarily remember how Europe used to look like during the Cold War, I put together a map which comes with my talking, which is to say that the Cold War period was the period when many of the international organizations that we talk about today were formed. NATO was particularly formed and came to life to fight the USSR during the Cold War. The EU is an idea that has been created during the Cold War as a cooperation between the European states to come together and to stick together for a better, prosperous reality that later on expanded towards East. For the Eastern Mediterranean part, the Cold War meant a lot of sphere of influence talk in the Middle East. It also meant that there was a sort of competition for resources, because obviously all the prosperous idea of the world, of the Western world in particular, but also the potential for a coming hot conflict needed energy. And most of the resources of energy were in the Middle East, which made the Eastern Mediterranean very important at the time, more important even than the Black Sea, which was a closed sea, except for Turkey on the south, that was a NATO member. Everything else belonged to the influence of the former Soviet Union. Now, after the Cold War ended, NATO has expanded, as well as the EU, towards the east to encompass those buffer states that were during the Cold War under the former Soviet empire as states within the USSR or as independent states, satellites of the USSR, meaning they kept autonomy, but in the same time, they were sticking to the policy imposed by Moscow. Now, some of the states have remained in the gray zone, which means they are not NATO members, and which makes them currently states where Russia is still fighting for influence. It is in between the 90s and the early 2000s, we have seen an expansion of the transatlantic world in a sense of its values and its ideas being ideas imported in the East and taken by the new member states of NATO and the EU, particularly because there was space made by the former Soviet Union collapsing and Russia diminishing as power. Now, in 2004, Russia woken up to the idea that it's going to lose influence in Ukraine, which was and still is a strategic state where Russia wants to maintain influence. And obviously, that would have made Russia to lose part of the Black Sea and, guess what, access to the Mediterranean. So in all geopolitical games of these regions, you have to take into account the dots that are being put together. Russia does not only want Ukraine and does not only want to have influence over Ukraine just because it wants to have influence over Ukraine. It wants to have access to the Black Sea so that it has access to the Mediterranean, and so that it makes sure that its goods are passing through, and it has a saying when it comes to international trade routes and when it comes to international energy trade. It is all coming together with politics and economics, and influence is never coming without the dollars or the euros or the rubles that are in store. Now, for this region, the most important part of the map, if you'd like, is where the Black Sea and the Mediterranean are coming together, which is the Bosphorus. First the Bosphorus and then the Dardanelles, but first the Bosphorus because that is the point where everything has to pass through in order to flow from east to west or west to east. Now, in the sense, the Bosphorus is making both Europe and Turkey coming together, and is also shaping Turkey into a regional power at times of instability in the two regions. Turkey has an imperative of keeping stability and keeping itself stable, considering its point on the map. Balancing between Asia, Middle East, and Europe is not an easy thing to do when you're surrounded by potential conflicts or pretty hot conflicts at times. In the same time, you have to maintain a powerful hand because of your own stability and its dependence on the straits. Now, Turkey increasingly becomes dangerous as it becomes more powerful or as it raises up. Why? Because its idea of power reflects, as in the case of Russia, growing influence. And that is when it comes to the Black Sea and when it comes to the Mediterranean. less than Russia, obviously. It has an expansion strategy of making itself into a regional power that is perceived at home, but also abroad. So in this sense, the Black Sea and the Mediterranean are being tied together because we're talking about changing times during pandemics, but also changing times in terms of fluidity of history, if you'd like. So as I said in the beginning of the 2000s, we had Russia as a rising power because they have because Moscow has realized that it's going to lose influence in the buffer states. At the end of the 2000s, after the financial crisis, we have Turkey as a rising power because it realizes how dangerous its position on the map is if it doesn't balance all the other rising powers in the region. Now, before I go to the even more complicated map of the Black Sea and Eastern Mediterranean, are there any questions, comments, or anything? I'm going to check technology. And I see there is something in from Dylan. Okay. Looking at your previous map, the Black Sea is at the height of the empire that was the Ottoman Lake. The Crimean War was fought with the Western powers in alliance with the Ottoman Empire against Russia. How does Turkey balance its own interests vis-a-vis the EU and Russia without a major conflict? That is a very interesting question coming right now because of what we are seeing in the waters of the Eastern Mediterranean and the Mediterranean, actually. Well, Turkey is trying at times to become an ally of Russia, while it also needs the back to be covered by a major power. Turkey is no longer an Ottoman empire, obviously. It wants to portray itself as a regional power, and its neo-Ottoman idea refers to the fact that it is rising. But its military capabilities and its political stability doesn't allow it to project power as the Ottoman Empire has done in its good old days. So in this sense, it cannot project power through a conflict. In the same time, its main interest is to keep the US engaged. As it needed back in the day to keep the British Empire engaged when it no longer was an empire, now it needs to keep the US engaged. And because it needs to keep it engaged, it cannot be a friend of Russia, really, because the US and Russian interests, although they have common ground in the Middle East sometimes, they collide on the Eurasian continent. So Turkey has really little and small room of maneuver when it comes to balancing. And therefore, its balancing act can only be done through tactics. One of them being what Turkey is doing right now with Libya and the waters of the Mediterranean, for instance. Another being how Turkey is diplomatically supporting or not supporting or meddling in the conflicts of the Middle East. So it takes windows. Obviously, to really balance and to really grow, it would need a conflict to show itself out. But the problem is that even with a conflict, you have to have a force to show it out. And Turkey does not have that force currently. Obviously, we have seen Turkey building up its military force, but not getting to a point where it can really sustain a conflict. Am I seeing another comment? It is a comment or question. Okay, it is certain that the Turkey's assertive actions in the Middle East and Eastern Mediterranean fit perfectly in the pattern of the neo-Ottomanism. How about Turkey's interests in the Black Sea? Could its interests change the status quo of the current Russian domination in the area? And the other question is a lot of questions about Turkey. Good afternoon. Thank you for your insightful presentation. Thank you. I want to ask if, from your point of view, what happened in Ukraine in 2014 was an orchestrated plan developed in the period of post-2000s, or is it just a precipitated reaction? Okay. I'm going to take first Turkey's question and then Ukrainian question, which is one of its kind. I don't want to give a presentation, so Dylan, please give me the eye if I talk too much on the second one. So first one first. Turkey's interests in the Black Sea. Okay, sorry. Technology again. Sorry. Okay, so I want to point on the map. So Turkish interests in the Black Sea refer mainly to making sure that the Black Sea is stable enough for vessels to pass through the Bosphorus. Now, because Turkey is in a good relationship currently with the US and has the interest to keep the US on its back, it also needs to cooperate with Romania and Bulgaria, and mostly with Romania, which is having a leg of the US in the Black Sea currently. So in terms of maintaining stability in the Black Sea, you have NATO in a sense, but mostly the US, Romania, Turkey, and if I were to go towards north, it would also involve Poland and the Baltics, working to contain Russia in the very same Black Sea. In this sense, obviously, it is a policy of containment. Now, in order to keep Russia in check, because as I've said, in windows of opportunity, you also have periods where Russia becomes the friend of Turkey, economics, and other windows of opportunity, you are basically seeing an accommodating Turkey. And the accommodation coming from Turkey is being seen in the Caucasus, where obviously Turkey does not share the same interests with Russia, but it does accommodate at times the interests of Russia. I'm going to give you an example. The frozen conflicts and the way that they are administered. When there is a friendly face turned to Russia, you are going to see Turkey backing off from supporting Azerbaijan in terms of the conflict that Azerbaijan has with Armenia, for instance. It's an easy one to do. It's a diplomatic step, nothing really that costs Turkey very much, but in the same time, it allows it not to fully engage and not to cause a potential conflict that could come against its own interest of stability in the Black Sea. Now, let me know if I've been clear enough on this one, because I'm going to address the other one, which is related to Ukraine. The 2014 was a building up event, starting from 2004, so 10 years back, when the very first colored revolution started in Kiev. So In this sense, it was a structural process that drove Ukraine to being what it was in 2014. It was also the West that played a lot against the Russian influence and built up its own influence in Ukraine that caused the Maidan revolution. And obviously, Russia, because it needed to act and save some face, it had to act. I'm guessing that this is what you are referring to. You're basically referring to Crimea when you are saying precipitated reaction. So basically, what you are seeing now in terms of Russia stepping in, taking Crimea, is a very normal act of choice. Russia could have not done another way because it lost territory over Ukraine. Ideally, Russian influence would have been on Kiev. Now, Kiev was lost in 2014 because the Western influence was there. With that lost, you have to keep what you can keep and what is very important for you to keep. So in this picture here, you're basically seeing the Kerch Strait Bridge, which is a strategic bridge that Russia built in order to keep Crimea in check. And for that reason, basically have the Black Sea in check. So you have to have Crimea in order to secure the Bosphorus, because otherwise you are not able to go through the Bosphorus if Turkey and Romania and therefore the US decides that you should not go through the Bosphorus. So if you're Russia, you want to have your foot in the Black Sea. Any other questions right now? Okay. So I see no other questions for the moment. I'm still sticking with this map, even if the computer seems to want otherwise. So to take it actually from Crimea, which is to say that when you're talking about geopolitics of the sea, you're talking about zones, the so-called economic zones and influence zones are coming together a lot more simpler on the sea than they are on the land. Because on the sea, the borders are basically saying how much territory you have for maneuvering. And for geopolitics, maneuvering is another key concept. So besides imperatives, interests, you have maneuvering in terms of windows of opportunity when you can move, or the idea that you have a passage through when you need one, or the idea that you can block a competitor through a maneuver on sea or land. Now, why did I say that? Obviously, for Crimea, as you can see, basically, when you got it, you got the portion of the Black Sea that makes you go closer to the Bosphorus. So obviously, you need to have the Bosphorus, as I said, and therefore you're playing with Ukraine. Ideally, you would have Ukraine to play your cards in the Black Sea and elsewhere. You cannot have that. Therefore, you're using your friendships. And this is why you're also more accommodating to Turkey. So it's not only Turkey that has an interest to accommodate at time Russia, but also the other way around. Okay. I'm seeing 2 other questions in the chat room, and I'm going to stop here. Do you consider the actions of Turkey, especially in the East Mediterranean, as a result of its stabilization process? If not, how do you evaluate them? Stabilization process. This is a very diplomatic term. There are titles that include stabilization. Let me show you another map that actually talks about the actions of Turkey. So Turkey has an interest in keeping stable on one hand and playing its cards of the so-called hub. So to be a hub, you need to integrate your roots. So you need to be an intersection for real. Obviously, geographically, Turkey is an intersection. Now, in order to be stable inside, so this is related to the stabilization process, you need to feed the idea that you're powerful. So, in other words, if you need to have the voters consider that everything is all right, then when economic troubles, you're acting outside the country, supporting the idea that your country is powerful enough to compete with other countries. So in this sense, you will always have the support of the inside when fighting the other, right? Now, stabilizing itself in regional terms, you basically work with external relations, with that body that I've shown in the slide, theoretical slide. What does that mean? That means that you have to have partners that are interested to go through your straits, to go through your territory, and that are interested in your position per se. At the same time, it means that you are able to provide options to your partners. So we know what Turkey can provide the US, for instance. We also know what Turkey can provide to the EU when it comes to the refugee crisis, for instance. We also know what Turkey can provide to Russia, right? So what does it do in Eastern Mediterranean? Well, Turkey wants a piece of what is going on there and cannot give away the idea that a competitor, which is in this case Cyprus, who is an EU member but not NATO member, so it doesn't really need to abide by anything. Obviously, you cannot leave room from the idea that you are opposing your others, the competitors. For the Turkish public, it is important that Ankara shows its power in the Eastern Mediterranean. For the others in the region, it is also important that Turkey show itself as a real contender in what Turkey perceives to be an easy win. Why? Because it doesn't really need to win anything. It's just face value winning. Now, the problem is that while Turkey has calculated and has established agreements last year with Libya, the problem is that now Greece and Italy stepped in and said, well, we don't really care about your agreements because they don't come along with international law. So this is where the seas come together. The same ideas that Russia has used, Turkey is trying to use in some other ways in the Mediterranean. So there are laws, unwritten laws of international law, if you like. If something has been broken once, it can be broken twice. This is why you are hearing on the news diplomats saying we have to stick together on fighting, I don't know what cause. Because if you don't stick together and the cause is broken, then someone else can break another cause. So now we're basically seeing a kind of a Russian approach on the Eastern Mediterranean coming from Turkey. And if I'm not mistaken, we are also seeing Turkey taking more action during the last days and saying that it will go drilling in the waters in the Eastern Mediterranean because there is nothing to stop it from doing so, considering Northern Cyprus is technically Turkish territory. So I've answered in a very long way to your question because the presentation was fit to answer the presentation. But in short terms, yes, it is part of stabilization, what Turkey is doing right now. And it is what it needs to be doing, even if we regard it critically. It's not doing anything awkward, considering its objectives. But awkwardness in terms of crisis, in terms of changes, can create other awkward tempos, meaning instability in these very precious points that we're talking about, Eastern Mediterranean and the Black Sea. Everything Turkey does in the Eastern Mediterranean brings about what is happening in the Black Sea because its connection to NATO and to its allies. So nothing is not connected, or anything is not connected, sorry, better English. Now, another question before I go on with the presentation, and I'm actually going to go back. Good afternoon. I would also have a question regarding the Syrian war and the current evolutions. How do you see the current retreat of the US from Syria and the slow-paced buildup regarding Russian supremacy in the relations with the future of the Assad regime? I'm not going to go into details with this because I know Dylan is going to look at me awkwardly, and I don't want him to be upset with me because I'm turning an Eastern Mediterranean presentation into a Syrian presentation. So to respond this, I'm going to connect the matter with energy because we have this map here. So in 2019, the US became an exporter of energy worldwide, switching its position from being an importer. That means that the US no longer needs to be that engaged in the Middle East. Remember that I've said that the Cold War basically meant a confrontation of ideas on the continent, but also a confrontation of influence in the Middle East where energy resources were. This is what I was referring to. The US needed to keep a network that provided it with energy because it needed energy to grow. Now, considering that right now the US no longer needs energy to grow because it's having the energy to grow itself. And also considering the economic problems that will follow after the pandemic, the US will continue what it has started long ago, I would say, at least 10 years ago, meaning pulling away from the conflict points of the world pulling away from the role of being the global policeman. What does this mean for Syria? Well, for Syria in particular, it means that Russia needs to be involved in Syria. So if until now Russia was keeping the US engaged in Syria in order not to have time to engage in other parts of the world, now Russia is finding itself engaged in Syria, something that is probably not to the liking of Moscow, considering its own resources and interests. With an US that will likely go away and focus this time only on those elements that it strategically need to be focused. So in this sense, right now, you're not seeing a Russia building up its power. You are seeing a Russia that is in trouble, bogged down in the Middle East, somewhere where it doesn't necessarily want to be bogged down. Obviously, Putin is not going to issue a press release saying that. But economic trouble in Russia, social problems in Russia, you obviously need to show the world that you're powerful. Yes, I want to be engaged in Syria. Well, guess what? The US is withdrawing. Your wish came true. Now what? Maintaining a war and maintaining the Assad regime takes money, which you probably will have for a while, but will need more from spending at home. In the same time, you want to spend those money in keeping what you already have, which is energy connections to Europe. It's not cheap. In the same time, you are dealing with a small, well, not small, low, that's a better term, oil price, which is also not creating money for a Russia that is dependent on the price of oil. So you are more in trouble than the US is in trouble. And the most in trouble is Syria. And the second most in trouble is Turkey, who's neighboring Syria and wondering what is going on next. So if you ask me if I'm going to see Assad regime continue, I don't know, and I don't want to answer the question. If you ask me if you're going to see a Russia in trouble next, more in trouble than it was, I'm going to say yes, it will be more in trouble. If that is good for Europe, I don't think so, because a Russia in trouble is a dangerous Russia. And with that, I'm going to stop on Syria, because I don't want Dylan to give me the look. And check on the other question, which is why present violations of international law as an unwritten law? Precedents of violation do not constitute international law. Well, on a related point, why suggest that the Republic of Cyprus is an EU member, but not a NATO member, and therefore does not need to follow any rules? I did not say that. So I did not say that Cyprus did not to follow any rules. The Republic is required to abide by international law. Isn't that the framework in which this entire conversation should be taking place? Okay, I see that clarification of what I said is needed. So first, I did not say that Cyprus does not need to follow any law. I said that once a rule is broken, then other states are going to see an opportunity for breaking other rules or similar rules. And that is the case of Turkey, not Cyprus. Cyprus did not break any rule, from what I know. So maybe you have proof to contradict me. And I made the parallel between what Russia has done in the Black Sea when taking Crimea with what Turkey has done by establishing an agreement with Libya, by setting an economic zone in the waters of Eastern Mediterranean that would go against Cyprus' interests, right? And with relation to NATO membership and EU membership, if Cyprus was a NATO member, then Turkey was a partner to Cyprus, because Turkey is a NATO member. Turkey is not an EU member, and Cyprus is an EU member. Therefore, their worlds are apart. So you don't have a partnership behavior between Cyprus and Turkey. And in the same time, you have the northern Cyprus, technically, I said, belonging to Turkey, technically, which is not in any way saying that Turkey has anything but influence, okay? Now, in the sense of, okay, I'm going to read because I see that it's also related to violations and cascading effect. This is so, well, this is what reality looks like. If you are going to break a rule, expect that someone else is going to break a rule too. And this is actually real life as well. So in a sense, never break rules unless it is absolutely necessary. I'm joking now, by the way. Okay. Now, getting back to my presentation, in the sense of how energy and how interests come together, we are back to this map where it's all related to business interests and economic interests that support strategy and support the politics and the political imperatives of the states in question. Why am I saying that? Well, obviously, you probably know by now that the alternative energy route coming from Eastern Mediterranean has become a tactic that is being used by all states in question in terms of discussing with the EU, but also in terms of discussing with within themselves when it comes to power balance. Now, in the sense of getting infrastructure built, you also have the relationship between Russia and Turkey. And here things are getting more complicated and more complex. So not only that you have alternative resources for Europe, business interests coming from Eastern Mediterranean states to support that route, Europeans also interested to support that route, but also Russia interested in supporting an alternative route to the Eastern Mediterranean line. Now, to go back to the very first, to the very first maps. You will have the natural reason for which the Turkish stream was easier to build than the Eastern Mediterranean stream. Not to mention that to build a pipeline is not enough to actually have resources to fill it. And Eastern Mediterranean still has to have exploration to fill in resources in the pipeline. But leaving that aside, you have different natural parameters to go through. The deeper the sea is, the more difficult it is for you to build a pipeline, letting aside anything related to international law and economic zones. You can easily see that the depth of the Mediterranean Sea is pretty higher than the depth of the Black Sea, which explains why Russia is in business now when it comes to getting its gas to Europe, while we are still talking about the East Med pipeline as a project. Secondary, it is always related to agreements between states. So when you have agreements, bilateral agreements, it is always easier to get on terms because there are just two to deal with, or to deal within. Even when you're talking about multilateral agreements, it is more difficult because everyone has an interest. So this is the case of Eastern Mediterranean pipeline. Now, currently, we're seeing a game, as I've explained earlier, due to the questions to whom I thank you very much for asking. We are seeing a game of Turkey, but also in the background, thinking about Russia and Russian interest towards the Eastern Mediterranean, considering these two are competing projects. And this is one very, very visible way in which the Black Sea politics are coming together with the Eastern Mediterranean politics, or colliding them. So what we're currently seeing, and this is actually my very last slide before questions, what we are currently seeing is a more aggressive Russia up north in the Black Sea for reasons that relate to the economics and social structural problems that Russia is facing. Also lost, after losing territories from its buffer states, it is only obvious that Russia is becoming more strategic, but also more aggressively strategic in making sure that it keeps what it has and grows its influence again. And in Turkey, in Eastern Mediterranean, we are seeing a Turkey that wants to keep rising up, needs to keep balancing the US and Russia, while also growing its influence and while also having business interests when it comes to Russia and Russian energy routes. And with that, I'm going to end my presentation so far, but please let's discuss and have questions and answers from me, but also questions and answers from you. So I may start asking you stuff. Okay.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Colibasanu. Very great presentation. So I see over here we have a question from Araru Dan. Do you think the Intermarium project can be seen as a response to the status quo of Cold War when Russian Federation projects its influence in the buffer zone states? And more important, do you think Intermarium can become a successful project in the process of countering Russian influence in Eastern Europe? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. The Intermarium project, to summarize for those that are not necessarily familiar with the term, is coming from history when Colonel Pilsudski, which was a general, not a colonel, in the Polish army, was basically supporting an alliance between Poland and the other states that on the Eastern Europe to counter influence from East and West. Now, the current Intermarium project involves the partnership between Poland and Romania, and ideally, as it was thought in the very first infant weeks, months, it would have involved Turkey as a NATO member, all supported by the US to contain Russian influence. So the idea of the Intermarium was to contain the Russian influence from the very beginning. Now, the Intermarium as a project, in order to contain that influence, needs to work at the different levels of society. So it does not take only the new containment line, which is clearly in the Eastern Europe now, stretching from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea, but it is also needed for it to work at the economic level between Poland and Romania and the states stretching between those two. So in short, yes, it can be a solution. Longer answer is we will see what kind of a solution it is. It needs to work. And for it to work, it does not take only defense. It takes more than defense. Yeah. Another question do we have?
Yes, I had one from over Facebook, and this question had more to do with, so how does Israel project itself in the Eastern Mediterranean? What role does it play in this interplay of major powers?
This is a very interesting one. Israel has worked to portray itself as a global power, not only as an Eastern Mediterranean power. Obviously, that strategy has served well to keep it as a state where it is and solve many of the perceptual problems in the Middle East itself. Obviously, in the Eastern Mediterranean, Israel is having a role, a very particular role in developing and selling its resources. So in this sense, when it comes to Eastern Mediterranean energy security, Israel has a very important role because it borders and has some of those resources that we are talking about for fueling the East Med pipeline project. So in this sense, it is highly involved. And yes, Turkish-Israel relations as well as Turkish-Israel-US relations are going to be shaped by what we are seeing currently in Eastern Mediterranean.
Thank you. Now, I had a question of my own. So what's so interesting about this idea of geopolitics is that there's so many dimensions going on here, and you were just talking about energy being one of those particular dimensions. But I really liked your point about how there's these gravity, like these centers of power, and they all converge in the Eastern Mediterranean. And one of that is being Eurasia. And I'm thinking Central Asia in particular, these nations like Afghanistan, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, that kind of are that major sort of center of power that we see this cross-cultural influence before it gets into the Middle East. And when we're talking about these convergences, I think of two countries in particular, Turkey and Iran, two major Islamic countries. Now, in Central Asia, we hear about the Belt and Road Initiative from China, which has this huge economic impact on that region, and then the political and military power from Russia that it has over the region. But when it comes to soft power dynamics, there's a lot to be said about, the Turkic populations and their relationship to Turkey, or the history of Persian culture and influence going back to the Safavid dynasty and even further back to the time of Cyrus. Now, do the two countries come into conflict with this sort of soft power dynamic in there, or is there sort of room to grow for both of them? And do they see like a return for their involvement in this part of the world? If that makes sense.
Do we have a deal to have a presentation about Central Asia anytime soon? So Yeah, what you were pointing out is a cluster forming currently, which is the cluster of security of Central Asia per se. And you've summarized very well. I'm not going to repeat anything that you said in other words. Point being that you have China and Russia as major continental powers, and you have Turkey and Iran raising powers with great potential of becoming influencers. Now, between these four, considering the US is withdrawing from many of its global policeman actor role, you are going to see alliances being shaped, considering what each of these powers need. So one of the larger scenarios is relates to what kind of space is it between Russia and China when we are talking economic influence. Currently, if we look at statistical information, if we look at trade flows, we're seeing a lot of Russia in Central Asia. We're seeing less China than Russia. As you pointed out, we are seeing a lot of Turkic population, which may mean that there is ground to be kind of built for Turkey to play with Russia, or for Iran to play with Turkey and Russia both. Now, we're at a point where we don't know how the pandemic is going to shape economic power for all of these countries. So currently, the major question, if you like, is how will we have the world coming together after the pandemic? What are the follow-ups in each and every countries of the pandemic when it comes to economic power? Because that is the blood of the system, of the political system, of the military system. So until we know that, and until we know how much China is going to be affected by a potential recession in the US, for instance, or a depression even in the US, until we know how Russia will react to its own economic problems, we cannot really set what the problems will be for Central Asia. But definitely, that region is going to play a similar role that the Balkans have played in the 90s for Eurasia. Not to say, and there is a particular reason that I've showed the map, the very first map, and then I zoomed into the three maps. The three maps are actually key for Eurasia. If I were to now speak of the theory of Mackinder, where you basically have the node that is important, and you need to be certain that you keep stable into the node itself. I would say watch the Balkans, watch the Caucasus, and watch Central Asia. These three are going to tell you what comes next in Europe, Asia, and Africa. Obviously, Africa includes the Middle East as the cauldron of all three regions that I've mentioned. So, yeah, this is the key question. The key question that we don't know the answer to, because we are having the pandemic and the numbers going out on the economic side are not very clear yet.
Thank you very much. And I guess for one final question, so moving a little bit from Eurasia and talking about the different constituent influences on the Eastern Mediterranean region, moving a little bit towards the Levant and Africa, we have with this coronavirus pandemic, this exacerbation of economic calamity that's been occurring in Lebanon, for instance. And Lebanon is sort of teetering on the brink And unfortunately, a large portion of the population right now in Lebanon is refugees from Syria and from other conflicts. So with the coronavirus occurring, how does this human impact and this effect on migration, how will that impact the sort of balancing act in the region?
I'm not an expert on the Middle East, meaning I'm going to hold back to comment in particular about Lebanon, because I know that those are specific elements to be taken into account. I do invite you, however, to search for our colleague Hilal on geopolitical futures, because he did write extensively about how Corona is attacking the stability in the region and in Lebanon in particular. But I will comment on broader region and if you'd like, even outside the region context of the pandemic. First, there is the problem of data. The problem of data that we are having now refers to the fact that you do not have comparable statistics, meaning reporting on data is not being done the same in European countries, not to mention that it is not done the same between regions. So we do not know the exact impact of Corona by just looking at infected persons or numbers of hospitalized or whatnot, because it is different that state react to the pandemic, and it is different that states report on the pandemic. That being said, the major problem that this pandemic is being underlining is the very differences between settings. Not speaking of particular regions, but the differences between classes, the differences between urban and rural, the differences between the migration population, whether those are refugees or migration population that refers to the labor force, and the ones that are local, the term local population, static population. All these differences are going to put even more pressure on the political systems that they resonate within. So we are going to see past the economic problems, we are going to see pressure coming from the very social pressure that these differences are causing within society. And I believe that, you know, as I am feeling close to your community and we can talk and we can exchange ideas, we are going to see even more of these clusters forming, in the sense of these clusters also posing pressure on the traditional politics that we have had. And this is how technology comes into play as a factor of shaping the world. But more importantly, this is how demography comes into play as a major factor of changing the world. So if I were to point a single factor that is going to change our world after the pandemic, that is going to be human resources. And in the Middle Eastern case, even if I'm not an expert, I would say demographics. That is the single factor that is going to change the world that they're in and that we are in, because, you know, Europe and the US is also in the framework. Yeah.
All right, Dr. Antonia Colibasanu, thank you so much. We really appreciate you coming on today and doing your presentation. That was very, very informative. Thank you all who asked all those wonderful questions as well. We'll be meeting up again at 2 o'clock Eastern time with Dimitri Saruhas to continue this conversation about geopolitics. Thank you everyone so much for coming out this morning, and have a wonderful day. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure. Thank you. Have a wonderful day.
We're glad to have had you.